that the reason why it was called Kabbalah for beginners is not because anyone here is a beginner. Everybody here is already advanced Kabbalah students. But the reason why we call it Kabbalah for beginners is to have the excuse to go back and look at the fundamentals. You know, sometimes you come to a beautiful house and you enjoy the dining room and the living room, but every now and then you have to go to the basement. You have to go to the foundation to make sure that the foundation is strong, that there's no leak, that the water, everything is strong and healthy. So going back to the foundations, going back to the basics is something that we have to do every now and then, maybe every year, every 7 years, every 10 years, whatever the case is, but every now and then you have to go back and you have to examine the basics, because the basics are really the foundation for everything else we do. So for the next 50 minutes or a little less, I think we should talk about a little bit something you already are familiar with, which is the concept of the two souls. And in general, the theme of the book of the Tanya, which tries to explain to us how to navigate the two souls. And because this is something you probably heard about before, I hope to do a little bit inside to get a little taste and a little feel for the concept as it was articulated in the Hasidic writings. So because this is so basic, we need a few general introductions. And once we get to the introductions, we could start thinking about what the sort of the contribution of Kabbalah and the Hasidic thought in particular gives to our life and our understanding and understanding of self. Because a lot of the Kabbalah talks about God, as we discussed in the last couple of weeks, in the God's order of creation, and then also talks about us, but this is really focused on the person. Now, so just a few introductions. One introduction is that for many generations, there were Jewish scholars who wrote about ideas of personal spiritual growth. People look at themselves, people say, I want to improve, I have different negative qualities that I want to overcome. And they would go to the sage, and the sage would give them a prescription of what you need to do, what you need to think about, what you need to meditate about. And maybe I will improve, I'll become a little less centered on self, I'll become more dedicated to others, more dedicated to the truth, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have a whole library of books on spiritual growth that each book or each part of the book tackles a specific area of growth. And that's really the model, the way it was done. When it comes to the book of the Tanya, which is the founding book of the founding book of the Chabad philosophy, written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of the Chabad movement, which was a branch of the Hasidic movement, here it's a very different book. Number one, it's a very small book. It's one book. It's 53 chapters, and that's supposed to capture everything you need to know on the subject of personal growth in some sense. So it's a very short book. Number two, it doesn't necessarily give you advice, step-by-step advice about how to improve in certain areas. How do I improve in this area or that specific area? It's not like, okay, this is what you do if you're feeling that you're too arrogant. And this is what you do if you feel that you are too narcissistic. Or this is something you should do if you feel that you have to improve in your communication. It's not a book, it's not a how-to in the sense that it doesn't address specific problems. But what it does, it seeks to get to what is the fundamental concept here? What's at the core of all of human struggle? And if you could understand what's happening within yourself and what's at the core of human struggle, then you'll already figure out what to do about the specific case. So that's how it does both those things. It's only one book, and it's supposed to be a roadmap to life. But it's not like, sometimes you go to a seminar, they say, okay, come for 6 weeks. And then when you come, you find that you have to buy the book, and you have to go on the retreat, and then you have to go on the trip. Yeah, there's always one more step. There's always, you buy this and then you do more, and then at the end you realize that there's still a long way to go, and then there's always selling you the next book, right? So Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, I'm not selling you the next book. This is the book you need. There's only one book. It's all you need. In fact, he tells you, he was a Hasidic Rebbe, so people would come to him for spiritual advice. He says, I'm writing a book so people should stop coming. I don't have time. You don't have time. It takes a long time to travel in Eastern Europe in those days. Here's the book. You take the book home. You have the book. You don't need to come to hear more advice, because this book captures everything. How could one book capture everything? How could one book solve every problem I may face? The answer is, if it's addressing the specifics of the challenge that I'm facing, then one book can never do that, because there's an infinite amount of challenges and there's an infinite amount of circumstances. So how could one book address that and think about every circumstance? But if the book does what Rabbi Shneur Zalman sought to do, which is explain to us the essential tension between what's going on within our soul, the essential tension of our life, and how to manage that tension, then one book is enough. So that's introduction number one. Introduction number two. Introduction number two is that people understand, you don't need the Torah to tell you this, but the Torah does tell you this. And the conventional understanding is that every person understands, I have what they call a Yetzer Tov, a good inclination, and a Yetzer Hara, and an evil inclination. In other words, sometimes I desire to do the right thing, sometimes I desire to do the wrong thing. And that is already in all the Jewish literature, going back to the Medrash, going back to the Talmud. There's a battle within the person of the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, of the good inclination and the bad inclination. That's what we know. Now, if I want to improve, if I want to be a better person, the model was, what people thought they have to do is, look, at some point, I have to get rid of my evil inclination, right? If I wake up in the morning and I want to rob a bank, what does that tell you about me? That means I'm not a moral, honest person. So I have to somehow change and rid myself of the evil inclination, and only desire good, and only allow my expression to my good inclination. And that's how I grow spiritually. And that's the battle within man. And if you're disciplined, and if you put yourself to it, you could then become a righteous person by ridding your soul of your evil inclination and only having your good inclination. And there are certain sources in the Talmud which would, in the Torah literature, which would allow for this perception, right? I'm one person, I got my good inclination, bad inclination. I have to get rid of my bad inclination, and I have to try to do the right thing. And I have to try to allow my Yetzer Tov and my good inclination to dominate myself. Now, what happens in reality? In reality is that this notion creates a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Frustration. This notion creates a tremendous amount of frustration. Why so? Because people were trying to improve spiritually. People were invested in spiritual growth. And after decades of investing in spiritual growth, they wake up in the morning and they look at themselves in the mirror. I don't mean the physical mirror. I mean, they look inside of themselves and they see we're at square one. We still have negative desires. Our evil inclination is just as powerful as it was before. Maybe it's stronger. So I'm trying to become a good person. I'm trying to rid myself of negativity, and I'm not being successful. So first of all, it's demoralizing. Second of all, it's depressing. And finally, it just causes me to give up hope and say, forget it. So I'm throwing in the towel. Spiritual growth doesn't work for me. And this is what happened. There were tens of thousands of people that used to go to their spiritual guides. They call it a Rebbe, but a Rebbe essentially is a teacher, but really a spiritual mentor. And they would pour out their hearts and say, look, we're trying to be better people. We're trying to focus on loving God and loving people and being a good person. I don't mean in action. They weren't robbing a bank, but who wants to be a person that wakes up every morning and with a desire to rob a bank? Now, rob a bank is just an example. Any other negative desire, fill that in. But some people don't care, but the spiritual seekers cared, and they go to the Rebbe, and they're trying to improve. They buy every book in the library, and they try to follow the advice, and it's not working because they're not getting rid of the evil inclination. So this was a tremendous problem, and it's a tremendous problem. It's an outgrowth of the understanding of the human soul and the model of there's me, I have a good inclination, I have a bad inclination, and that was the conventional model. But it wasn't the true model. It never was, but it was never articulated until the Kabbalah comes around. Specifically, it begins from the Arizal, student of the Arizal, Reb Chaim Vital, in the Eitz Chaim, and then elaborated upon by the Hasidic movement and codified by Rabbi Shneur Zalman. So what does Rabbi Shneur Zalman say? He says, look, the model of I have a good inclination and I have a bad inclination is true, but it's not complete. That's not the full model. That's not the full picture. The true picture is far more complicated. The true picture is not that there's me and I have a good inclination and I have a bad inclination. In other words, I have some desires to do good and some desires to do bad. But really what's happening here is that there are two me's, there are two souls. And it's much broader than a desire to do good and a desire to do bad. There are two souls. One he calls the godly soul, one he calls the animal or the natural soul. Now, it happens to be that I also have a desire to do good and a desire to do bad as a result of these two souls, but it's much broader. And there are tremendous ramifications to this idea, the shift from not looking just at the good inclination at the evil inclination, which is true. We all have a good inclination and the evil inclination. We know it from ourselves and we know it from the Torah. Certainly from the rabbinic literature, from the Talmud, from the Medrash. So this is all true. We're not saying it's not true, but we're saying we were only looking at one little dimension. There's so much more to the story. What's the story? There are two souls. What do I mean by two souls? And so he explains what he means by souls. But in simple English, there are two personalities. What is a soul? A soul has 10 faculties. We mentioned it the first class. 10 sefirot is a whole personality. There's intelligence, there's emotion, there's desire, there's pleasure. That's a whole person. It's a whole spiritual makeup of a person. We call it the 10 sefirot. So there's the 10 sefirot of the godly soul, there's 10 sefirot of the animal soul. There are two souls, two essential motivations that are contradictory, that are battling within myself. Who am I? I'm either one or none or both. In other words, there is no me. There is no me. That's the key here. Not there is no me. There's two me's. That's the key here. Now, that's the big idea. How does this big idea help us? So it helps us in multiple ways. Number one, this is dramatic. Dramatic is you cannot try to rid yourself of your evil inclination. It is impossible for most people. Why? If I'm one person and I have a desire to do good and a desire to do bad, so you say, stop being schizophrenic. If you're honest with yourself, and if you're genuine, then if you love to do good, you should despise to do bad. So the first model, the incomplete model, which thought that I am one person, I want to help the poor, and I want to rob a bank. Say that you can't live like that. That's contradictory. Obviously, your desire for good is not genuine if a moment later or at the same moment you also want to harm people. You also have a negative desire. So in the old model, you have to rid yourself of the evil for your good to have meaning. Otherwise, you're completely disingenuous. Otherwise, you're a fraud. You claim to be wanting to love God and desire good and everything else good. Meanwhile, simultaneously, a minute before, a minute after, you have evil thoughts. So obviously, you're a fraud. That is the old model. The new model is, of course, you're not a fraud. There are two specific, separate, distinct personalities within yourself. One wants to do good, one wants to do bad. It's not a question of the one who wants to do bad, or it's not true that it wants to do bad. That's not accurate. One could want to do bad. Let me put it that way. One could want to do bad. That does not paint or taint is the word I'm looking for. That doesn't taint your desire to do good. One has nothing to do with the other. It's two personalities. The problem with the two personalities is that these two personalities only have one body and one mind, meaning to say they both need the person, the physical brain, the consciousness and the brain and the heart and the body to express itself. If you want a metaphor, if you have two hard drives connected to one screen, right? Each one has its own program. Each one runs its own operating system. right? If you have an Apple computer and you have a PC, whatever they call it, Microsoft computer, but you only have one screen. Now, they don't really talk to each other. They're two different programs, but they're all fighting over the same screen. 1 second, the Apple wants the screen. A minute later, the Microsoft wants the screen. And they're fighting all day from morning to night. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, says the Kabbalah, that's at the heart of all tension in your life. All tension in our life, ultimately, if you want to go back down to the level of, the essential level of the subconscious level, all tension in a person's life is both those souls battling for expression. And that battle could become difficult, and it could tire you out. And therefore, it's very important to understand how to manage the battle. And if you manage the battle, you will have a good life. The most important thing about managing the battle is to fight the right battle, and don't fight the wrong battle. Don't fight the battle that's impossible to win. What's the battle that's impossible to win? The notion that I could rid myself of my evil inclination. The notion that if I love God, I'm not going to love anything negative. That was the old model, where I'm one person. I'm one person that loves God and also loves negativity. In that notion, you can't do both. How could you love two opposites? So the old notion, people were trying for decades to rid themselves of the evil inclination, to rid themselves of desire for negativity. The old model, not just you didn't win because you didn't know the tactic, you cannot win. It is impossibility for most people. What's the new model? The new model is your job is not to rid yourself of the evil inclination. Your job is not to rid yourself of the desire to do negativity. Your job is to make sure that as much as possible, your screen is connected to the right computer. I don't want to take sides between Apple and Microsoft, so I'm not going to name names, but assuming you like one of them, your screen should be used for one of them. In other words, allow the positive side of self, allow that expression, allow the positive side of self to express itself in your thought, in your speech, and in your action. And that's all. That's the goal. And it's not as romantic. Doesn't sound that great. I'm not going to be able to rid myself of the evil. Sounds very mundane. But that's a difficult goal, very difficult goal, but an achievable goal. And because it's an achievable goal, that's what we should be doing. And what I want to do today is read two little sections of Tanya, not the whole chapter, but two little sections. One section that describes the battle, and the other section which describes why God creates this battle. In other words, in the old model, where you can get rid of your evil, we understand you have a challenge, you overcome the challenge, and you get the reward for overcoming the challenge. But in the new model, where I'm not really ridding myself from evil, all I'm doing is I'm connecting my screen to the godly soul instead of to the natural soul. If that's the model, and I'm never going to win the battle. In other words, I am never going to resolve the tension. In the old model, I could resolve the tension, right? Once, if I figure out how to rid myself of the evil inclination, I could live happily ever after and sit and study Torah all day and no distractions, right? That's the utopian view, which was impossible. But at least I understand. Oh, that would be purposeful. But if I'm a person, and most people, we're telling this to most people, you will never be able to rid yourself of a desire for negativity. In other words, it's a little bit of a depressing statement. For the rest of your life, every day, you're going to wake up and you're going to have to manage the negativity within your soul. Nobody wants to hear this. This is depressing. Like, what's the point? Why would I every day of my life want to deal with the same challenge? And it's very depressing. So to deal with this issue, we have another series of chapters, but we're specifically going to look at one chapter and explains the beauty and the purpose of a battle that you can never win. Who wants to go into a battle they can never win? That's our life story for most people. So what's the value and the purpose and the excitement about a battle you can't win? That's the two things I want to do today. The two sections of Tanya. Again, one describing. Again, I'm not even going to read the full chapter, but a little bit. We'll read a little bit of the part that describes the battle, and one that a little bit that describes the purpose of the battle. Now, I cannot underestimate enough what's happening here. What's happening here is we're shifting the whole battlefield. The purpose is not to rid myself of negativity. If that's the purpose, guaranteed for most people, they're going to end up, first of all, they're going to fail, and they're going to end up with frustration. It is an impossibility for most people, except a very, 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 very few exceptions. Now we have to figure out how to deal with the battle. We're not going to get to that today, all in one day. But we want to figure out. We want to get a description of the battle, and we want a description of the purpose. Because really, what we're really saying is, I'll make a confession. I'm hitting a certain age. I'm hitting 40, and the Talmud says, "Ben arbaim lebina." When you turn 40, you get wisdom, you get understanding, and at some point you say, "Well, I'm going to hit a certain age, a certain level of maturity, and I'm not going to have to deal with negativity within my soul." And that's what I would think. It's very, very seductive to think that. Reality is, come back to me in a decade or two, I probably will tell you, unfortunately, I'm still dealing with negativity. So now, what does that do for you? Isn't that depressing? Well, for that, you have to read chapter 27, which explains to you why it's not depressing, and explains to you the beauty and the challenge and the drama of the battle, and why it's something you want to embrace and you don't want to just make peace with. So this is the second introduction. Now that we said the second introduction, we'll take a few questions if anybody wants to ask a question or say a joke or anything else, and then we'll maybe read a few lines from the holy words of the Tanya.
Well, you mentioned that the book was written for the spiritual seekers, right? For example, if you're Russia or somebody who is totally not interested, it's outside the scope, right?
Yeah. So what happens if a person is not a spiritual seeker? I'll make a confession. I had this problem. That, first of all, I loved the Tanya. When I was 15, some Jewish books are written in very complicated language. Rabbi Shneur Zalman, when he writes the Tanya, other places it's hard to understand. Even in the later sections of the Tanya, it's hard to understand. When I was 14 years old, I knew Hebrew, so I could read the Tanya myself. And my teacher, we would learn it in high school, and I would just read ahead. And it was a beautiful book, written, any 14-year-old can understand it. It's written so beautifully and so clearly, and it's amazing. So I loved the Tanya. Came a time that we started teaching, that the JLI did a course on Tanya. I think Vicky was there. And right away, I ran into a very big problem. Because the problem with the Tanya is that if you don't, that it's written for a spiritual seeker. And not everybody is a spiritual seeker. And the way I coined, the way I articulated the question that Vicky just asked is, I said, let's look at I remember it was very frustrating for me at the time. Something like 2007 and maybe 2008. So I articulated the question, the frustration, by reading the foreword of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author's foreword. And I'm going to read through the author's foreword. And after the second sentence, I get stuck. What's the author's foreword? Here it goes. Being an epistle sent to the communities of our faithful, may the Almighty guard them. He writes, I'm writing this community to the faithful, to our people, and may Hashem guard them. You ready? To you, O men, do I call. That's quoting a verse. So he's very poetic. To you, O men, I call. Okay, that sentence I could still live with. Fine, I could live with. Next sentence, this was very hard. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, who seek the Lord. Also playing on a verse. So this book, if you seek the Lord, if you're looking for righteousness, if you're looking for intimacy with God, this is a great book, because you got the tension and you have to manage the tension, and you're not going to figure out how to manage the tension with other books, because you're going to be climbing up the wrong tree. Again, I have to clarify. It's not that the other books are wrong. The other books are right. But the other books, you don't have the full map. Imagine you have a map and you only have a little piece of a map, and you don't understand where that piece of the map you have plays into the relation of where you are. So of course you have a good inclination and a bad inclination, but there's a much bigger picture. There are two yous, and therefore there are two inclinations. Oh, so now it's not that I am schizophrenic. It's not that I have two personalities. It's not, in other words, it's not that I am contradictory. It's not like I want two opposites. There are two souls that want two different things, and therefore they're going to clash. So when in 2008, I said, what am I going to do? How am I going to get, and I'll speak for myself. I said, I don't know that I said, not forget about the students. The students see God, but does the teacher see God? Maybe not. I want to wake up in the morning. I want to have my coffee. I want to have my steak for dinner. I want to enjoy the day. I'm a seeker of God. This is a book for seekers of God. Ours is everybody a seeker of God. And that was a very big problem that I had to deal with for myself personally, not internally. And of course, after thinking about it for a little while, the answer is that if you buy, if the theory is true, which it is, that everybody has two souls, then even the person who thinks that they're not a seeker of God, it's because 50% of the personality is suppressed. And part of the book is read the holy words and inspire yourself to get in touch with 50% of my personality that is suppressed, which is the godly soul, because the godly soul wasn't able to connect myself to the screen, which is the conscious mind. So the answer is everybody is both a seeker of God and a seeker of self. In other words, the animalistic side is seeking self. So the answer is everybody is both. That's part of the thing. So some people who are consciously seeking God know which book to buy, and they buy the book because they have a problem. But the people who don't feel that they're seeking God, then they in Yiddish they say erst. They're the first. They even more have to buy the book to desire to get in touch with that side of the personality which is suppressed. And like any psychologist would tell you, that if you suppress something for too long, it's going to express itself negatively in other ways. And people who suppress their godly desire, it's not like they have an easy life, because that suppression expresses itself elsewhere in negative ways. So that's the short answer. By the way, I wrote this up and I sent it. I thought I liked it. I liked what I wrote. I sent it to Tzvi Freeman. It was a good writer on Chabad.org. And he, in his kindness, instead of telling me that it wasn't written well, which it wasn't, in his kindness, he told me, "Oh, I think you have to read this book about writing, and it's going to help you." And that's what I did. I listened to his advice. I bought the book, and I read it, and I read it, and I go back and read it. And because of him, I continued writing. But that was very kind of him, not to tell me your writing is not great. Instead, he told me, go buy the book, which I did. Okay, that's just a little history from how many years ago? 13 years ago. Go ahead, Sarah.
Rabbi, could you give an example of the suppression of a desire which could express itself in a negative way? Because that's really interesting.
I think there's a tension. Look, I'll get to the point. The point here is, according to the philosophy of the book, part of me wants, the animal soul and the godly soul. Let's speak in simple English. Part of my soul wants to connect with something greater than self. In other words, the godly soul wants to transcend. We discussed this last week. I think that the more spiritual I get, right? We said connecting to somebody else is a spiritual act, or could be a spiritual act. The more I go out of myself, the godly soul wants to transcend. That's what makes it happy. When the godly soul is forced to focus on the physical, when it's forced to focus on the self, it is in prison, it is uncomfortable. On the other hand, you have a natural soul, and the natural soul is designed to want to survive and want to seek pleasure, not negative. This could lead to negative, but it doesn't have, let's get the word negative out. The natural soul is designed to focus on self. I will call it the self-oriented soul.
So that would be the ego.
That would be the ego, very similar to the ego, right? Correct. But the point here is that while Freud says at the core of what I am is my ego, and what Hasidic philosophy said 150 years before him, and really this knowledge that's when the Tanya was written, but the knowledge was codified before that, was passed on before that. That's only part of the story. So it's not that Freud was right or wrong. It's that's part of the story. But in addition to that, you also have a part of yourself that wants transcendence. And if you don't go beyond yourself, that part of yourself is in pain. Now, that pain could come up and express itself in other ways, right? I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a lay person when it comes to psychology. But I think that the psychologist will tell you when I'm suffering, it's because there's an unresolved tension within my soul, an unresolved trauma that sometimes expresses itself in a negative way. So in some sense, if I never find expression to the part of self that needs transcendence, there's going to be an unhappiness in my life, and that unhappiness is ultimately going to sabotage. Because whatever I do in my healthy, self-oriented self, to build a life, to build a family, to go on vacation, to enjoy myself, and to do all these good things, but I'm not going to be happy because part of myself is suppressed. And if I'm not happy, that's where people self-sabotage. You look around the world and you see some people who are very successful, they have everything, and then they do foolish things, and they do foolish things that puts everything that they have, all their happiness, it puts it in danger. And you say, isn't that foolish? Isn't that foolish? The answer is, of course it's foolish, but the answer is they're not happy, they're suffering. Why aren't they suffering? Because they're not living a wholesome life. Why aren't they living a wholesome life? Because they're not managing the tension between the two souls. Now, not managing the tension between the two souls, sometimes it looks like a battle. I wake up in the morning, part of me wants to do something constructive and part of me wants to do something destructive. That's one expression of this tension. And then what Vicky is saying is that sometimes I'm only interested in self and I'm not finding any expression for the part of myself that wants to transcend. And if that happens, then this tension is in the level of subconscious. And if it's in the level of the subconscious, but it's not resolved, then I'm not going to be happy. And sometimes I look at my life and I say, I should be happy. Why am I not happy? I checked all the marks, right? I did everything right. I got all the degrees. I joined all the clubs. I have all the cars. I have my yacht. Why am I not happy? The answer is because part of yourself, not you, part of the person's self is being suppressed. Which part? The part that needs transcendence. And that's a very important thing to understand, that just like I have to feed my body, just like I have to feed my natural soul, I also have to feed my spiritual soul. Feeding my spiritual soul means find times to allow it to express. And there are different ways to do that. In the terms that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is writing, because he's writing specifically to a Jewish crowd, he uses the examples of do another mitzvah, do another commandment in the Torah. But the concept is true universally. The concept is true universally that every person needs to transcend. And every person has a desire to transcend. And you see that. That's why people join, political movements. Why? Because the human psyche, the soul needs something greater than self to be able to join, to be able to contribute to. Because if my whole life is only about self, in the long run, that's not gonna bring me happiness, because I'm gonna have this unresolved tension. Now, we have nothing against the self-oriented soul finding expression, but it has to be done in the proper way, and that's what other chapters deal with. Because otherwise, it can become the focus on self could become destructive, and we don't want it to. We want it to be constructive, and that's part of the dance. That's part of the battle.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now I think we don't have that much time left. I think we're going to skip the first thing I wanted to do, which is the description of the battle. And I think we'll go straight to the middle of chapter 27. I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to think about what is the purpose of the battle. What's the purpose of the soul coming down to this earth to be able to in order to engage in a battle that it could never be fully successful in by the old definition of success, which is to rid the self of the negativity.
What chapter is the description of the battle?
So it's a whole lead up. There's a few chapters, but the part that really where everything comes together would be, I think, chapter 9. In other words, chapter 9 is one place where it happens. It's not a description of how to manage it. It's a description of what each soul wants. So it begins with it's a relatively lengthy description.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to the lessons in Tanya. Why not? A little bit easier to read. Chapter 27. Let's share the screen. Okay, we'll try again because it's freezing. Whoops. Ay, ay, ay.
If it's on Chabad.org, we can just go there.
I think as my computer froze, it looks like, oh, there it goes. No, now it worked. Okay, wonderful. Okay. Okay, so what's the big picture before we get to this part? Before we get to this part, we're saying what the book is saying up to this point is that I can't necessarily control a negative thought that falls into my head. In fact, or a negative desire that falls into my heart. In fact, in the old model, that would be the fact that I have a negative thought is a sign that my devotion to positivity is not genuine. Because how could I then also want something negative? But in the new model, that is not an indication, because the godly transcendent soul wants one thing, and the self-oriented soul wants something else, something opposing, and that is self-understood and natural. The problem is what happens when a person was going to feel bad. If I tell you for the next many decades, you're every day going to deal with some form of this tension, of this battle within the soul. So it's not, you're never going to overcome it. Isn't that a bad feeling? So let's see what happens. Let's going to read a little bit, and we'll see. Maybe we'll skip around. Maybe we'll just read. We'll see how this goes. Therefore, so this is the middle of a chapter. So we're getting therefore. Therefore, one should not feel depressed or very troubled at heart. I'm just going to be the bold. We'll see. For now, I'm just going to be, you see my little mouse here, you can follow along. Even if he be engaged all his days in this conflict with the thoughts which will always enter his mind. For perhaps this is what he was created for this is the service demanded of him, to subdue the sitra achara. Sitra achara is the other side, meaning the negativity, constantly. Concerning this, okay, so in other words, he's saying this is the purpose of your creation. In the old model, the purpose of my creation is to get to a point where I'm righteous, where I no longer want to do anything bad. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no, that's not the purpose of your creation. For most people, the purpose of the creation is to engage in this battle. And he quotes a verse. He quotes a verse from Job. In the first page of Tanya, he asked the question. Job tells God, you created righteous people and you created wicked people. So the question on the opening page of the Tanya is, if God created righteous people and wicked people, does that not imply that there's no free choice? So how could God say, choose the right path, if he himself created me to be either righteous or wicked? So Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains that verse, and he says something fascinating. Concerning this, Job said to God, you have created wicked men. In other words, you created righteous and wicked. as though it were preordained that one man be wicked and another righteous. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no. The implication of Job's statement is not that they were created to actually be wicked, God forbid, i.e., sinful in thought, speech, and action, but that there should occur to them in their thoughts and musings alone that which occurs to the wicked, i.e., that evil thoughts should enter their mind as they do in the mind of the wicked. This is very interesting. The verse itself, in other words, the question was, it says, Job tells God, you created some people to be righteous and some people to be wicked. That would seem to be a contradiction to free choice. And we know God did not determine whether I'm going to be righteous or wicked. That's up to me. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, what Job meant in the verse is you created some people that are righteous, meaning they are not challenged. They have no desire for evil. That is the very small minority, tiny minority within people. But most people, you created them wicked. Not that you created them to be wicked. No, you created them to have negative desires. And that's how we explain that words. In other words, that is their purpose. And they shall eternally wage war to avert their minds from them in order to subjugate the Sitra Achra on the other side. Yet, they will never be able to annihilate the Sitra Achra in their souls completely, for this is accomplished by tzaddikim, by the righteous. In other words, God created certain people that for their whole life, they're going to be engaged in a battle with the negativity. And now the question is, isn't that not depressing? So the first step of the answer to is that not depressing? He says, that is your purpose. In other words, don't climb up, don't try to achieve something that's not your purpose. My purpose, as is the purpose of most people, the term coined in the Tanya is the Beinoni, the intermediate person. The average, not average, most people will be people that they are created. The purpose of their creation is not to overcome the negativity, but to battle the negativity. Now, what's the purpose of that? Now we go to a very interesting metaphor. Metaphor is as follows. There are two types of pleasure that God could receive. And there's a beautiful metaphor, so I'll tell you the metaphor first. The metaphor is that there are two types of food. Some people, many people, like sweet food. However, sweet food is not the only type of food that is pleasurable. There's also a certain pleasure of tasting savory food that is spicy. But you're not going to eat the spice. If you eat the spice, it's not good. But if you prepare the spicy dish properly, it can bring you great pleasure. And that's the metaphor that's going to follow. But there are two forms of pleasure. For some, God likes sweet food, but he also likes sour and spicy food. That's a metaphor for the saying that there is a beauty when a life could be completely sweet. Sweet means in this context, devoid of tension, devoid of frustration, devoid of challenge. There's a certain pleasure of having no challenge. But then there is also a pleasure that you get from spicy food. Spicy food is when there is a challenge and you continuously overcome the challenge. Overcome means not rid yourself of challenge, but manage the challenge. And that is the purpose, and that is a great pleasure to God. In other words, when we used to look at the old model, we used to think that God would get pleasure from the righteous. And if I desire to do negative, and I can't rid myself of that desire, then somehow I am less successful in my mission on this earth. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, no, the few people who are not challenged, yes, they bring pleasure to God, but that's not the only form of pleasure. That's not the only form of beauty and pleasure that God will enjoy. In fact, by the way, if God enjoys it, we could also enjoy it. In other words, what we're saying here is if you can tap into God's pleasure, then I too will have pleasure. And the point here, what we're saying is that there is this tremendous pleasure from savory food, which is something that by itself is not tasty, but if you manage it properly, it can bring you great joy. So let's read in the holy words of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and we'll see if we can explain. There are two kinds of divine pleasure. One from complete annihilation of the Sitra Achra of the other side, and the conversion of bitter to sweet and of darkness to light, which is accomplished by tzaddikim, by the righteous. So that's very good. If you can rid yourself of, most people can't, but for the few individuals who can rid themselves completely of the negativity, they can bring pleasure to God. That's wonderful. But on the second, when the Sitra Achra is subdued, while it is still at its strongest and most powerful, soaring like an eagle. In other words, the desire for negativity within my soul is powerful. And yet, I do not allow it to find expression in my thought, speech, and action. That is the pleasure that God gets from the savory food. And from this height, God topples it in response to human initiative. This is accomplished by Beinonim. This is the metaphor of the eagle, is a biblical metaphor. We're not going to get into that right now. And this is a beautiful metaphor that we said, but it's also, they're going to set it up beautifully. If you go back to the story of Isaac in the Bible, before Isaac wants to bless his son, before he dies, he wants to bless the older son. He tells the son, go make me delicacies. And if you give me delicacies, I will be able to bless you before I die. And we know the whole story, how Jacob steals the blessings of Esau, but we're not going to get into that right now. What we are going to say is that when the father tells the son, make me delicacies, that is an expression of God telling his people, his children, make me delicacies. And it doesn't say make me a delicacy in the singular. It says make me delicacies in the plural. And that's the metaphor. There's two types of joy that we can bring, that we can create. So let's continue. This is alluded to in the verse, and make me delicacies such as I love. Again, these are the words of Isaac telling his son Esau. But the Kabbalah says he's expressing a deeper truth. This is God speaking to God's children. The word matamim, delicacies, is written in the plural, indicating two kinds of pleasure. These words are the charge of the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is the feminine expression of the divine presence, to its children, the community of Israel, as explained in Tikkunei Zohar. So this comes from the Zohar, which is the Kabbalistic, a very early Kabbalistic work. That with these words, God asked for the Jewish people to please him with their divine service. And here's the metaphor of the food. Just as with material food, there are two kinds of delicacies, one of sweet and luscious foods, and the other of sharp or sour articles, which are unpleasant to eat in their natural state, but have been well spiced and prepared so that they become delicacies which revive the soul. So too are there two kinds of spiritual delicacies. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the big idea. The big idea is that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is telling me that the fact that I wake up in the morning every day and I feel unsuccessful because today I'm back to quote unquote square one. Today too, I have to battle the negativity within myself, and I feel like I'm being unsuccessful. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no, you're missing the point. You're missing the point. When I have a battle within myself between, am I going to do something constructive or destructive? Am I going to allow my transcendent part of self to express itself, or am I going to focus on the natural self? Now, this takes so many different expressions, right? There's so many different expressions for this. It doesn't have to be only in the spirit, in the religious context. It's in any context. Your child comes home. I'm reading the newspaper. Now is a battle. Am I going to transcend and seek to connect to other person, or am I going to just focus on what's good for me? And this, we consider all day bringing expressions for this battle within the person. But what we're trying to say here is the fact that every day the battle rages is every day is another opportunity to tap into the pleasure of overcoming challenge and not ridding oneself of challenge. Ridding oneself of challenge is a certain form of pleasure that certain souls get to enjoy. They call them the souls of the righteous, but that's not really, obviously God that doesn't like that much sweetness, because then he would create more souls who don't have the challenge because he wants more candy. But God doesn't only like cotton candy; He also likes spicy foods. And what spicy foods? The joy and the excitement of dealing with the challenge, of battling and persevering. Every day is a new opportunity to battle the challenge. And we see this in human nature. Human nature is not very happy when there's no challenge. Like I like to say, when people solve all the challenges in their life, they create artificial challenge, and that is golf. They have to play sports. What's a sport? Person needs a challenge in your life. If you don't have a challenge, you're not happy. Why not? You have everything's fine. You can sit on the couch with your feet up. Everything is fine. No, you need challenge to overcome, because that's even within the human psyche, which is a reflection of God's own, of the way it is within God, that God derives a certain pleasure. So if I look at myself and I say, I'm however age I am, and today I have to battle a drive for negativity within myself, I could look at it and say, well, that means I am a failure. That was the old model. The new model is to embrace the challenge, because this challenge is where I fulfill the purpose of my creation. And in fact, it's actually challenge. It's actually, you can get pleasure from overcoming this challenge, because you know that this is the purpose of my creation. And this is the challenge, that this is what God wants of me. And this is what brings pleasure to God. And I could figure out, and I could learn to enjoy the process and enjoy the challenge of the battle while the battle is in full gear. So that is just a little bit of a taste of the Tanya, but I feel like it's good to read it in the original, and it's good to go back to the essence, because essentially what we're saying here is that all tension within the human soul is associated with managing this challenge. And because it's so important for us to do everything with joy, to live a joyous life, we also want to understand and frame this battle as not just a necessary part of life, but actually an enjoyable part of life. The battle is an enjoyable part of life. It's like, imagine a life with no sports. No, you need, now is the Olympics, maybe it's associated with the Olympics. People need competition. People need challenge. People understand that within challenge lies the greatest, it's not easy. Challenge is not easy, but the fact of the matter is that where there's risk, there's reward, and challenge is where the pleasure lies, at least one form of pleasure. And therefore, God forbid to think of ourselves as this is a sign of our failure. To the contrary, this is a sign of the opportunity to enjoy the pleasure of overcoming the challenge. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in very short. I'm not even going to say in a nutshell, because that would imply that you have the whole story in the nutshell. Maybe this is part of the nutshell. But in any case, I hope you enjoy. This has been enjoyable for me. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Any comments or questions or thoughts, please feel welcome to share.
Rabbi, this has been just a teaser, you know.
That's right.
I mean, I would like to go and become a rabbi myself.
Yeah, so
after this.
we have a lot of Tanya opportunities during the year, also with Mariashi. She usually every year does a series on Tanya, so that's good. But yeah, we always have something going on. It's not in this form, in another form, but there's always something going on. So we'll make sure.
August is an empty month. There's nothing in August, but we'll start in September again, I guess.
Well, we have some weekly classes, which is, let me just close this down.